Okay, let's jump right in. 72. Think about that number for a second. That is the number of completely distinct ethnic tribes, each with their own rich histories, languages, and unique cultures, living right now within the borders of just one single landlocked territory in southern Africa. And yet, despite that absolutely immense diversity, somehow all 72 of these groups have managed to come together to forge exactly one incredibly resilient, unified nation. So, welcome to this explainer. I am super excited to guide you through this material today because we are going to unpack the absolutely fascinating and frankly really complex history of Zambia. We'll be looking at its wild journey from ancient, powerful kingdoms straight through the harsh realities of a colonial copper rush all the way to its emergence as a modern multi-party democracy. Now, here is the big question we're going to be answering together today. How exactly did a landlocked territory of 72 distinct tribes not just survive intense colonial exploitation, but actually rise up to become the vital liberation anchor for the rest of southern Africa? It's really a story of a massive pendulum, swinging from exploitation right back to empowerment. Here's how we're going to break this all down today. We're starting with ancient roots and kingdoms, then moving into the colonial copper rush, tracing the road to independence, looking at building a new nation, examining multi-party democracy and economics, and finally wrapping up with culture and regional anchor. All right, part 1, ancient roots and kingdoms. To really understand modern Zambia, we have to look way, way back into the past. Human habitation in this region stretches back over 100 millennia. It's wild. Archaeological finds on the copper belts actually show stone tools being used literally 125,000 years ago by early Khoisan hunter-gatherers. But the real game changer? That happened about 1,500 years ago. That's when Bantu-speaking peoples migrated from Central and Western Africa, bringing agriculture and iron technology with them. This completely transformed the landscape, right? It led to the formation of these powerful tribal groupings. Then, fast forward to the 1820s, the region saw massive upheaval with the invasion of the Ngoni people, who were fleeing conflicts further south. And that really set the stage for the colonial era that formally kicked off in 1890. So this pre-colonial era was really defined by these dynamic, intense clashes. On one hand, you had the Lozi people, led by their chief, Luanika. They were all about sedentary agriculture and really deeply understood the complex environment of the Zambezi floodplains. But then, on the other hand, you had the Ngoni. These were proud, warlike, nomadic invaders with Zulu origins, and they were basically ravaging many native peoples in the region. But the Lozi were smart. They used their environment to their advantage. The physical obstacles of the Zambezi River essentially acted like a giant moat, isolating the Ngoni and allowing the Lozi to eventually push them back and secure their own power. Moving right along to part 2, the colonial copper rush. So, right as these local kingdoms were figuring out their boundaries, a completely different force started moving up from the Cape in the 1880s. British interests were swooping in, driven pretty much entirely by the hunt for mineral wealth. Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company, which was this quasi-government organization, was actually granted a royal charter to establish a protectorate in 1890. And the impact on the local population? It was immediate and it was severe. Get this, by 1930, 90% of the land in northern Rhodesia was confiscated. European settlers grabbed the most fertile soil, and local Africans were forced into what was called a landless laborer system. They were pushed onto restricted reserves, basically just to ensure a cheap labor supply for those booming copper mines. Now, you might be wondering just how frantic this early copper rush actually was. Well, it brought about some seriously bizarre historical moments. In 1909, prospectors were apparently so desperate to find the exact whereabouts of copper oxide that they actually imported wire-haired terriers and, no joke, a big baboon, hoping these animals could somehow just sniff out or detect the minerals. I know, it sounds totally absurd, but it hits the nail on the head when trying to picture the chaotic, feverish greed driving those early colonial extraction efforts. Okay, let's jump to part 3, the road to independence. Obviously, a system of exploitation like that couldn't last forever. Right after World War II, political consciousness just exploded, mostly driven by terrible labor conditions and massively unequal education. It really kicked off with the rise of African trade unions in the 1950s, which started shining a bright spotlight on the glaring unfairness of colonial racial laws. This paved the way for a super charismatic political operative named Kenneth Kaunda. He stepped up to lead the United National Independence Party, demanding immediate self-governance. And this wasn't just talk, it escalated into direct action. Widespread strikes and massive rioting in 1959 literally shut down the entire Copperbelt economy. Finally, the pressure was too much, the British conceded, and on October 24, 1964, Zambia officially achieved full independence. Which brings us to part 4, building a new nation. Imagine for a second being handed the keys to a brand newly independent republic, but it's one where foreign capital had already firmly entrenched all the economic power for decades. It's a huge challenge, right? So to combat this, President Kenneth Kaunda introduced this guiding philosophy known as Zambian humanism. Basically, this was a massive policy of national reconciliation. The main goals were to eliminate the racism of the colonial era, promote real equality, and drive the Africanization of both the civil service and the economy. The government started aggressively promoting public ownership in crucial sectors, things like transport, agriculture, and finance, really trying to give everyday Zambians a genuine stake in their own country's wealth. However, the actual implementation of those ideals, well, that led to some massive structural shifts across 2 totally distinct eras of Zambian politics. By 1973, under what was called the First Republic, all opposition parties were banned. Zambia was declared a one-party state, with Kaunda installed as life president, which, as you'd guess, led to a highly politicized civil service. But then, fast forward to the Third Republic in the 1990s, and we see the pendulum swing again. Zambia dramatically transitioned back to a multi-party democracy under the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy. They swept in, introduced heavy privatization, and basically dismantled that whole one-party apparatus. But here's the thing, regardless of who was in charge or what the political system looked like, the new nation faced this one inescapable geographical reality. The source material captures it perfectly, stating, Zambia inherited a country in difficulty, landlocked and reliant on neighbors for trade. And that simple fact of geography, being completely landlocked, ended up dictating so much of Zambia's economic and foreign policy going forward. All right, part 5, multi-party democracy and economics. So let's take a look at how being landlocked combined with wild global markets actually impacted the nation. Spoiler alert, it triggered an absolute economic roller coaster. Back in the 1970s, Zambia saw a massive windfall thanks to a giant global copper price boom. They were riding high. But then, almost overnight, global copper prices suddenly collapsed. Right at the exact same time, oil prices skyrocketed. And because Zambia's economy was almost entirely tied to the price of copper, this triggered 25 years of devastating economic decline. By the 80s and 90s, the government was literally forced to introduce super strict structural adjustment programs and rapid privatization just to keep the economy from completely sinking, which obviously caused immense domestic hardship for everyday people. As you could imagine, all that economic pain fueled a huge desire for political change. The 1991 elections ended up marking a historic, massive shift. The MMD party won an incredible 101 out of 105 parliamentary seats, peacefully ending Kenneth Kaunda's decades-long rule. But while this transition was a huge victory for multi-party democracy, it wasn't a magic fix. The new era still had to struggle heavily with deep institutional corruption and the incredibly complex realities of trying to reform a broken economy. And finally, part 6, culture and regional anchor. Now, we've talked a whole lot about politics and economics today, but Zambia's true strength really lies in its people and its incredibly solid principles on the world stage. Because despite its own huge economic struggles, Zambia sacrificed deeply to become the literal liberation anchor for Southern Africa. Think about this. To the south, they backed liberation forces in Zimbabwe, which meant suffering through border closures and ruined trade. They fiercely opposed apartheid in South Africa, literally risking outright war with the South African army. And to the east, they supported Frelimo in Mozambique, costing them their vital, quick routes to the sea. Time and time again, Zambia routinely put the freedom of its neighbors way ahead of its own immediate economic stability. And driving all of this immense national resilience is a seriously vibrant cultural heartbeat. Remember those 72 tribes we talked about right at the beginning? Well, together, they share 42 distinct traditional music styles. And music in Zambia, it isn't just for entertainment. It's literally a vehicle for social order. It's used to express family distress. It's absolutely vital for mourning sessions and funerals. It marks important village initiation periods, and it celebrates the planting of maize. It is even actively used as a tool for publicly rebuffing socially unacceptable acts in the community. It's just this incredibly rich tapestry of art that conveys the teachings and meanings of everyday life. So that brings us right to our final question for today. We've seen this massive pendulum swing, right? From ancient tribal supremacy to brutal colonial exploitation to the birth of a brand new nation, through total economic collapse, and finally to a democratic rebirth. It is literally a masterclass in resilience that anyone trying to navigate a changing world could learn a thing or two from. So, with its vast natural wealth, its incredibly rich cultural heritage, and its resilient democratic infrastructure, can Zambia finally align its resources to secure the prosperous future its people so clearly deserve? It's a fascinating question and one the whole world is going to be watching closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.